It began at exactly 0900 hours on September 19th. Inside the quiet control rooms of Estonia, radar operators were watching the usual morning traffic over the Baltic Sea. But then, their screens flared with a warning that shattered the routine. 3 Russian MiG-31 Foxhounds suddenly broke formation, banking south. They crossed the invisible line near Vandloo Island, cutting straight into Estonian sovereign airspace. No transponders, no radio calls. Just 3 massive interceptors running silent. What the Russian pilots didn't know was that they were already being watched. Since the moment their wheels left the runway at Petrozavodsk, NATO eyes were on them. The MiGs pushed 10 kilometers deep into NATO territory, holding steady at 30,000 feet, the optimal altitude for their Zaslon M phased array radars. Below them, 400,000 Estonians were starting their day, completely oblivious to the fact that $500 million rubles worth of Russian hardware was overhead, testing the strength of NATO's Article 5. The Russians began to circle. They were likely baiting a reaction, waiting for Estonian jets to scramble so they could manufacture a close encounter for their propaganda reels. But they had no idea that the hunters had already arrived. 2 Italian F-35 Lightning IIs, part of NATO's air policing rotation, were already on station, and they were playing a completely different game. The Italian pilots hadn't even switched on their active radars. They didn't need to. Their distributed aperture system, a ring of 6 infrared cameras stitched together by software, had already picked up the intense heat of the MiG's twin Soloviev engines burning at 1200 degrees Celsius. Through their $400,000 augmented reality helmets, the Italian pilots could look straight down through the floor of their own cockpits and see the Russians clearly. They were tracking them by heat alone, remaining electromagnetically silent. To the Russian radars, the F-35s didn't exist. The F-35 has a radar cross-section of about 0.005 square meters, roughly the size of a golf ball. The MiG-31's radar was built to find massive B-52 bombers the size of warehouses, not a stealth fighter smaller than a seagull. While the Russians circled arrogantly, NATO's integrated air defense system began to tighten the noose. This wasn't just a scramble, it was a coordinated ambush. From the east, Finnish F-18 Hornets pushed forward, deliberately keeping their radars on to herd the Russians westward. Over the Baltic, Swedish Gripens lay in wait, their radars cold, receiving targeting data silently via Link 16. This data link updates 128 times a second, creating a single, shared brain for the entire alliance. Estonian ground controllers vectored these assets without speaking a word over the radio. It was a digital hive mind engaging 3 pilots who were still shouting encrypted voice commands over UHF, like it was 1985. The Italian F-35s climbed past 25,000 feet, executing a cold intercept. Their AN/ASQ-239 Barracuda electronic warfare suites were actually tracking the MiGs by listening to the Russians' own radar waves. Every time the Russian Zaslon radar swept the sky, it gave the Italians a precise location fix. The hunter became the hunted, powered by the very energy they were emitting. The MiG pilots began to get twitchy, checking their 6 o'clock, that instinctive look back that fighter pilots have done since the Red Baron. At 9:12, the lead Italian pilot finally broke the silence on the guard frequency, the Universal Emergency Channel. Russian aircraft, you are in NATO airspace. Turn east immediately. The Russian response was pure deflection. The pilot radioed back, we are currently on a scheduled flight, proving he heard the warning perfectly. But in Russian military culture, obeying a NATO command is tantamount to admitting a mistake. So they kept circling, pretending they owned the sky. But inside their cockpits, the warning lights began to sing. Their SPO-15 threat receivers started chirping vague, confusing signals. It was electronic noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The Italian pilots slipped into the MiG's blind spots, hovering directly above or below them, places where the MiG's mechanical radar dishes physically couldn't point without rolling the aircraft. 2 stealth fighters tracking 3 heavy interceptors who were completely blind to their presence. The gap in technology wasn't just measured in years, it was measured in eras. It was time to show these Cold War relics what modern warfare looks like. The lead MiG pilot tried a classic move, a violent dive to low altitude. He was trying to hide in the surface clutter, hoping the radar waves bouncing off the ocean would confuse the targeting computers. The Italian F-35 pilot didn't even flinch. His AN/APG-81 radar utilizes advanced Doppler processing. It can distinguish a fighter jet moving at 500 knots from the waves moving at 20 knots, based purely on velocity. The MiG was just burning fuel in a useless dive, while the F-35's computer adjusted the firing solution in real time. tracking him like a predator watching a limping gazelle. Realizing the dive failed, the Russian pulled up hard, twin afterburners dumping fuel to climb back to 40,000 feet. The MiG-31 excels in the thin air of the stratosphere. Technically, it can hit Mach 2.8, but speed is irrelevant when your enemy is invisible and your engines are screaming your position to every infrared sensor within 200 kilometers. Inside the Russian cockpits, confusion was turning into genuine fear. Their threat warning systems were having a nervous breakdown. The Italian F-35s were using their Barracuda electronic warfare suites to inject false targets directly into the Russian sensors. 1 second, the scope showed 12 bandits, then 4, then 0, then 20. The Barracuda does this by catching the incoming enemy radar pulse, modifying it slightly, and shooting it back with a delay. It tricks the enemy radar into seeing ghost aircraft at different speeds and ranges. The Russians were effectively fighting hallucinations. That's when the Swedish Gripens revealed themselves. They had been lurking 80 kilometers away, silently receiving data from the F-35s. Suddenly, they flipped their pulse Doppler radars to maximum power. The MiG's threat receivers went from confused chirps to a screaming panic tone. 2 new contacts, bearing 180, closing fast. The Russians thought they were dealing with 2 invisible Italians. Now the Swedes were boxing them in from the south. The Finns were pushing from the east, and the F-35s were somewhere. This was a classic honey trap. You use visible threats to sphere the enemy straight into the path of the invisible ones. The Gripens went loud on purpose, pushing the MiGs north, right into the waiting jaws of the F-35s. Sweden had joined NATO practically 5 minutes ago, yet here they were, executing complex tactical coordination like veterans. The Swedish pilots saw everything the Italians saw: speed, altitude, fuel state. When one pilot spotted a target, the entire network saw it instantly. The lead MiG tried to break west toward the Baltic Sea, desperate for international airspace. The F-35s cut him off without ever appearing on his radar screen. One Italian pilot lit him up with a targeting radar for exactly 1 second, just a spike to make the threat receiver scream, then went silent again. The Russian pilot yanked the stick, banking hard. Then the second F-35 did the same from a different angle. Spike, silence. Spike, silence. The warnings were coming from everywhere. The MiGs were thrashing about, bleeding energy and fuel in defensive turns against ghosts. One Russian pilot tried to fight back electronically, activating his Gardenia jamming pod. He was trying to jam the F-35's radar, but the F-35's radar hops frequencies 1,000 times per second. It was like trying to stop a conversation by shouting at one person while they switched languages instantly. The Italian systems barely registered the attempt, worse for the Russians. The rest of NATO was waking up. Polish F-16s were launching from Malbork. German Typhoons were roaring off the runway at Log. NATO's Combined Air Operations Center was vectoring jets from across the continent into a single kill box. The MiG pilots probably thought this was a local spat with Estonia. Instead, they had triggered a response from Stockholm to Rome. They were about to find out why the Baltic Sea is now NATO's lake. Then the lead MiG pilot made a massive miscalculation. He turned his nose toward Tallinn, Estonia's capital, as if to buzz the city. Immediately, the alarms in NATO command centers changed pitch. An armed Russian fighter heading toward a population center of 400,000 people changes the game from provocation to potential act of war. The F-35s moved to intercept, but not with brute force. They began herding. An F-35 would spike the MiG from the left, forcing a reflex turn to the right. Then spike from below, forcing a climb. They were steering the Russian jets remotely, using the pilot's own fear to push him away from the city and toward the Polish and German fighters assembling to the west. The chess match was ending. Physics was taking over. The MiGs had been maneuvering hard for 15 minutes on afterburners. Their fuel was critical. Kaliningrad was 400 kilometers away. At their current burn rate, they had maybe 18 minutes of flight time before they became heavy gliders. The smart move would be to ask for help, declare an emergency, and land in Finland, but that would mean surrender. So they kept flying, pretending they were in control while their options evaporated like kerosene in a jet pipe. That's when the Polish F-16s arrived, and they didn't come to play. Their radars locked onto the MiGs instantly hard locks. No subtlety, just pure electromagnetic aggression. The Polish pilots carried the weight of history in their cockpits, and they were eager to deliver payback at 30,000 feet. From the south, the German Eurofighter Typhoons swept in. The Typhoon is an air superiority beast, twin engines, super cruise capable, and armed with the Meteor missile. They took the high ground. positioning themselves directly above the exhausted Russian jets. The MiGs were now surrounded by 10 NATO fighters from 5 different nations: Italian stealth, Swedish grit, Polish aggression, German precision, and Finnish persistence. Every direction was a kill zone. Even the Danes and Norwegians were reporting in, spinning up jets. It was as if someone had kicked an anthill. Fighters were launching from every base within 500 miles, converging on 3 Russians who were rapidly running out of fuel options. And Dignity, the lead F-35 pilot, decided it was time to end the charade. He switched his radar to single target track, focusing the full power of the array onto the lead MiG. Inside the Russian headset, the warning tone became a continuous, solid note, the sound of death. It means a computer has calculated your speed, your heading, and the exact flight path a missile will take to destroy you. The Italian held the lock for 5 seconds, just long enough for the Russian pilot to visualize the impact. The F-35's computer showed a 97% probability of kill. The AIM-120D missile is a mad dog once it's off the rail. It hunts autonomously. It doesn't care about flares. It doesn't care about jamming. It just eats. The Russian pilot's nerve finally broke. He keyed his mic on the guard frequency, returning to base. The 3 MiGs banked sharply west, toward Kaliningrad, but NATO wasn't done. As they turned, the Swedish Gripens slid into position just 500 meters off their wingtips, close enough to see the rivets. Their targeting pods began recording in high-definition 1080p, capturing every antenna, every weapon, every tail number. Intelligence gold. At the Polish border, the F-16s took over the escort duty with the energy of bouncers tossing drunks out of a club. They kept their radars locked, keeping that warning tone screaming in the Russian pilot's ears for the entire 400-mile flight home. This is what's officially known as aggressive escort, and unofficially as maximum trolling. Link 16 kept the data flowing. Swedish computers talked to Polish computers, handing off the targets seamlessly. German Typhoons flew top cover, ready to dive if the Russians tried anything desperate. The MiGs were forced to fly at maximum efficiency speeds, slow, boring airliner speeds, just to keep from flaming out. As they approached Kaliningrad, Russian Su-27s scrambled to meet them, probably expecting to welcome home heroes. Instead, they found 3 terrified MiG-31s being shepherded by half the NATO alliance, like delinquent teenagers being marched to the principal's office. The Italian F-35s watched the Russians cross into their own airspace, then banked west toward home. They had been airborne for 2 hours, had fuel to spare, and hadn't even turned on their main radars until the very end. The dominance was total. The technological gap was embarrassing. This wasn't just an interception, it was a statement. Russia tried to test the waters of the Baltic, and they discovered it's a NATO lake. They proved they can't even enter without permission, supervision, and a heavily armed escort home. If you like deep dive in military, please don't forget like, comment, share, and subscribe for more informative videos. Thanks for watching.